Greetings. Welcome to our annual joint IAUW-ICHS Legislative Wrap-Up session. My name is Maggie Snyder, and I am on the policy team with Lucinda Nord at Indiana Association of United Ways. I also help staff the Indiana Coalition for Human Services. We are joined by David Sklar, who is on the board of the Indiana Coalition for Human Services and serves as vice president. We are still catching up from the changes in the final hours of session, and some bills may have not been signed by the governor. So please understand that this is a quick overview. If you type your questions about a specific bill in the chat box, we will either answer the question during the session or as a follow-up email to you. Lucinda will start us off with general information about this short session.
Great, thanks, Maggie. The 2016 session of the Indiana General Assembly was a short session where legislators aimed to address certain issues and which generally do not impact the budget. Budgets are handled during the long session in odd years. The House and Senate Republicans comprise a so-called super-duper majority where the Democrats are far outnumbered, 71-29 in the House and 40-10 in the Senate. However, if you review vote counts on individuals' bills, most of the vote counts include broad bipartisan support and often unanimous approval, especially in those final days of the session. However, you will see certain bills where the votes are actually divided along party lines or where some characteristic or philosophy may affect the view, and we'll show you an example of that later. For example, there might be some vote splits related to urban or rural districts, different Tea Party influences, religious influences, or how the property tax caps might have affected local governments. And we actually see one of those in the bill around the HIP bill. So the governor and the legislators each made their case about how they were going to address their priorities. So the governor announced his priorities in the State of the State address, and you can see his 5 priorities here, all of which were covered in some way during the session. And then all 4 caucuses and the governor indicated their priorities, most likely around education and infrastructure issues, while the Democrats and moderate Republicans were eager to enact some civil rights legislation. Election year politics sort of derailed this effort this year. The front page of your newspaper and local third house sessions likely covered many of these issues you see as the hot issues listed for 2016. The I-STEP and civil rights issues tended to dominate the first half of the session. The second half of the session focused more on roads and some very specific, narrow issues. Throughout the session, legislators considered substance abuse issues from treatment to criminal penalties. So you'll see lots of bills on the bill list about meth and heroin specifically. While we will not cover all of these topics in our presentation, we invite your questions about any of them if you have questions.
For the last 2 years, the Indiana Coalition for Human Services has grouped our priorities in 5 areas, which you can see in bold. We want to take this opportunity to celebrate bills that have made progress in these areas. In the Healthy Hoosiers category, we want to celebrate the increased attention to mental health and substance abuse issues. In the Working Hoosiers area, we are very pleased to see the multiple bills around individual development accounts, SNAP, and parental leave receive attention. In the Workforce Ready Graduates, after-school programming received attention. In the Thriving Communities area, many important issues were discussed, even if they didn't make it across the finish line. We have provided a list for all the recommended legislative studies. On the following slides, we will review the bills that were enacted by the adjournment on March 10th. The governor may sign, veto, or allow a bill to become a law without his signature. Most are awaiting governor's action at this time of the webinar. We are listing the bill numbers so you may link directly to the bill from the slides and notes. Please note that there were over 825 bills introduced and about 217 were enacted. We will go through these bills rather quickly, so if you have a question about a specific bill, please type it in the chat box. If we don't answer your question here, we will email you.
ICHS has been concerned over the last couple of years about healthcare coverage and closing the gap. We celebrated the federal approval of the HIP 2.0 program in January of 2015, and while we support HIP, we testified in support of additional flexibility in HIP 2.0. Senate Bill 165 codifies the principles of HIP 2.0, including the specifics of the power accounts, lockout period, and incentives into law. While not ICHS bill priorities, we'll tell you about a number of other bills. For example, the cap for medical malpractice was increased for the first time in 20 years. An example of a disagreement between the House and the Senate was on the abortion bill, House Bill 1337, where the prohibition of abortions for anomaly, gender or race was amended in the bill, and that was not vetted by the House, and so there was a lot of discussion about process. If enacted as law, it will likely face a constitutional challenge. And as Lucinda already mentioned, there are a number of bills in response to the heroin and meth issues that are being faced around the state. There have been numerous bills related to pseudoephedrine, basically trying to either require pharmacists to consult or screen prospective buyers or to limit purchases by people with drug crimes in their backgrounds. Other bills address access to opioid overdose drugs, access to opioid treatment, and additional substance abuse treatment available through county jails and community corrections. There are new crimes for intent to manufacture, and also let me talk a little bit about House Bill 1347, which was supported by ICHS members. This bill addresses mental health provider capacity by allowing interns of clinicians in community mental health centers, but not other providers, to bill Medicaid. It also included language to study navigator capacity, training, and adequacy. And here you'll see more of the drug-related bills that we mentioned.
Families working to provide savings for their disabled children will be able to set up ABLE accounts. And partially in response to the investigative piece by the Indianapolis Star on the Adult Protective Services System, there will be a study about the right number of caseworkers, training, centralized intake, triage, and more. Additionally, there is an effort to protect endangered adults from financial crimes. Home health workers will now be subject to criminal history checks. And finally, we want to call your attention to the new optional ID bracelets and cards that will be available for people with disabilities. Think of this like the health alert bracelets, but so that a police officer or EMT provider would understand how to interact with a person on the autism spectrum.
So helping working Hoosiers and those who want to work to support themselves has been a primary focus for ICHS and IAUW. And we've had great success this year with increasing awareness about a number of critical services such as IDAs, SNAP, college aid for part-time students, and fresh food. The fact that we've had so many hearings on these important issues in a short session should be considered a major win for human services. Allow me to call your attention to a few. So individual development accounts will now be available to people with incomes up to 200% of federal poverty level and will be allowed for vehicle purchases. That's in the Senate Bill 325. Working adults may be eligible for financial aid as part-time students, and that's a part of the EARN program. And then for those of you in rural areas, township trustees will be able to prepay for utilities, which is a common requirement for rural electric cooperatives. I also call your attention to a couple definitions here. The civil proceedings advance payment transaction in House Bill 1127 is actually a fancy new definition for lawsuit lending, and the bill actually provides some regulation of it, of the practice. And then long-term small installment loans are a new type of loan product proposed by payday lenders. This, we actually helped with a lot of partners work to create a study committee on the issue rather than expanding that sort of predatory lending. We will continue to monitor these types of programs. Then finally, I want to call your attention to Senate Bill 15 there at the top. Fresh food and food deserts will be studied this summer. So we hope, it was recommended for study at least. We'll talk about those studies in just a moment. And even though a few of these bills died that you see on this slide, we are declaring a small victory for having hearings and strong committee interest and even passage in one chamber. So there's a growing awareness on both sides of the aisle about how many hardworking Hoosiers are working but not getting ahead. So we celebrate the progress on these and look forward to bringing these back next year.
This session there were a ton of complicated bills that affected public education, school scholarships, teachers, performance, payments, and student transfers, and more. It really was one of the defining issues of this session. Early in the session, there was a quick fix regarding iStep to hold teachers and schools harmless because of last year's test results. The iStep program will now in fact sunset in 2017, and a panel will be created to determine its replacement. This situation in Flint, Michigan created a testing program in schools for safe water. There are a number of bills related to trying to anticipate the right kinds of jobs that will need specific training and education for the future. Certain scholarships will be available to students going into teaching, including for minorities. And we will have a process for out-of-state teacher licenses. If you have specific questions, we can research the status and get back to you on any of those education-related bills. While we're also thinking about children, there are a number of bills related to children with a special focus on human trafficking, child pornography, sexual abuse, and crimes involving the internet. Generally speaking, there's an effort to ensure that children that are the subject of human trafficking are still treated as children and not prostitutes. Parental rights may be terminated for the rapist of a child who is the product of a rape. Adoption information from before 1994 will now be available through ISDH, and a number of bills related to foster care and CHIN's provisions passed through the General Assembly. Finally, partially related to the recent news about child abuse in schools, there will be a new child abuse registry that was created.
Okay, moving along. So we have a number of issues that we've placed in the Thriving Communities area. This is usually where you find bills related to the community well-being or tax issues. While the short session is not where we deal with budget issues, you will find 3 budget issues in the roads bill, which was House Bill 1001. This bill provides $800 million in new road spending, which is a split between local roads and state roads, $42 million for the third grant of the Regional Cities program by the governor, and $29 million for the Retired Public Employees 13th Check program. There are a couple of bills related to nonprofits that we just want to highlight for you. Just know that there's a growing attention to nonprofit accountability and endowments, especially with institutional funds, and that's where you see some university and institutional fund bills. And then lastly, one that we were involved in, the pilot legislation in House Bill 1180, I just want to call your attention to because there's a growing interest by local governments to impose pilots, which are payments in lieu of taxes for nonprofits. So while 1180 was a very specific issue, there will be increased attention in this area that we will continue to monitor. I also call your attention to a few bills that didn't pass. The Senate Bill 220, the Bias Crimes Bill, did not make it across the finish line. We still remain one of 5 states that does not have this kind of legislation to increase the penalty if the crime is based on the certain characteristics of a person, for example, a GLBT or race, which might be more important going forward. Finally, there were a number of what we call good government bills that didn't pass because this is an election year and legislators perhaps didn't want to make a change in the way that people register to vote or actually vote. These things did not make it to the finish line. So now I'll turn it back to David.
We know that we'll get a lot of questions probably on some other issues, and there's a lot of bills that we haven't covered, so we wanted to put up a list of some other issues that may have reached the front page of your local newspapers. The BMV is a state agency that touches nearly every Hoosier. A massive bill reduced and aligned fees. A number of firearms bills did not pass, and most alcohol bills didn't advance through the process, though there was some specific expansions related to microbreweries, hard cider, and more. The police body cam bill, which is House Bill 1019, was highly controversial throughout the session and provides a process for video to be released to media and family members. There were a number of bills that preempted local governments from enacting ordinances related to workforce policies, plastic bags, and beverage issues. And finally, there were many bills related to veterans, including language that makes the definition of a veteran consistent throughout Indiana code.
So sometimes when legislators can't agree on language, they will assign a topic to an interim study committee. So when you read the language in a bill that urges the Legislative Council to assign a topic, it may or may not be assigned. The Leg Council typically meets in May and then makes those assignments. Other times, the legislature will mandate a specific committee to report on a specific issue by a date, usually right before the next session. In the next 4 slides, we want to call your attention to some of the studies that were either urged, established, or required. So that's all of them were urged if they're listed, but if they have an REQ, they were required, or if it's EST, it actually establishes a particular committee to do that. So we'll let Maggie start with a few on this slide.
So we want to call your attention to 2 on this slide. First, Senate Bill 192 prescribed a fairly comprehensive study of adult protective services. For those of you who remember the CPS study and the resulting recommendations, this study feels very similar if it is completed. Another is Senate Bill 251, which aims to mirror the Early Learning Advisory Council and a study of out-of-school time, which includes before and after school.
On this page, we want to give a shout out to the study of low-income housing property tax exemption. Legislators have many questions about this. What is the appropriate income range for a housing unit to be considered low income? Whether a multi-unit building should be 100% low income or mixed development or more. Lucinda already mentioned House Bill 1340, but this is one that we will want to definitely watch so that there is no expansion of predatory lending in Indiana. And finally, we want to call your attention to House Bill 1369 related to juvenile justice. Since this was assigned specifically to the Commission on Improving the Status of Children, we are quite certain that it will be studied this session. One other thing that was not contained in legislation but has been authorized by legislative leaders is a study this summer of immigration policies and the effects of undocumented immigration on things in Indiana like public assistance programs, education, and the economy, and we will make sure to be very focused on that as well.
And can you go back to the Senate Bill 15 quickly, David?
Yes. We'll just call your attention to Senate Bill 15, which attempted to consider food deserts where Hoosiers do not have a grocery nearby, or perhaps the closest store is a convenience store. So they will take a look at this issue of fresh food initiatives and food deserts and see what can be done to and help incentivize businesses to locate in those areas and provide fresh produce, and what can be done to affect the food desert phenomenon.
Okay, so that wraps up the bill-specific section of the webinar, but we want to fly through a few slides about how you can get involved this summer. First, we want to remind you that you, as a nonprofit, can lobby and educate your legislators. Yes, there are rules about lobbying, which is spending your organizational resources to lobby your legislators or to ask your constituents to ask your legislators for a specific bill or policy change. Most of what we do in the nonprofit arena is education and awareness. It's advocacy. We are simply telling stories of our organizational mission and what certain policies or investments mean for our clients or communities. And it is absolutely critical to have you as a volunteer or your board members and volunteers tell that story. Because it is an election year, we want to remind you about the cardinal rule for 501c3 nonprofits, that none of your nonprofit resources may support or oppose a candidate or party. No services such as statements, no campaign contributions, and you may educate and lobby your candidates. You may not campaign for them or support them in any way with resources from a 501c3.
Thanks, Maggie. So we want to remind our friends how to get started in advocacy. If you're nervous or new to advocacy, remember that all of us were new at one time. There are lots of resources to help, so here are a few ideas just to get you started. There are lots of things that you can start doing now. Some of your legislators are actually holding wrap-up third house sessions, which are available on our website at iauw.org. There's a third house calendar. If you like a bill that your legislators passed, then thank them. Be sure to check their vote and thank them, and we'll show you how to do that right now. In fact, so let me just pull up. We gave you an example a little earlier of how this is the legislative website at in.gov/legislative, and sometimes we can pull up a bill count, or a vote count, excuse me. So I pulled up the bill for the Healthy Indiana Plan, Senate Bill 165. So this is an example of the final concurrence vote. So this was a bill sponsored by Senator Pat Miller for the Healthy Indiana Plan, and you can see that the vote was split 34-16. And if you look at that bill count, you may know that the noes, actually, it was not a partisan vote, although most of the Ds, in fact, I think all of the Ds, Democrats voted no, but there were a number of Republicans that also voted no on this bill. So you'll want to check a vote count, see if they supported what you agreed with, and then you can actually thank them for their vote or explain why you add additional information that they might value. We also encourage you to submit letters to the editor or guest editorials. Now is the time to educate your board, your volunteers, and your staff. If your nonprofit relies on public dollars, or that your clients rely on public dollars, it's really important to help your board and volunteers and staff understand the importance of policies. If, for example, you work in a home health organization, you know that criminal background checks are going to affect your organization. So you'll want to talk about important policies to your work. You want to map your relationships. You may not know a legislator, but one of your board members probably knows someone who knows them. You can invite the legislator to come tour or visit your organization and maybe talk about issue. We also encourage you to, if you're having an event, invite them to come. You can invite candidates to come to your organization, or you can attend those candidate forums. Later this summer, we'll be distributing questions related to human services through our newsletter. It's really important that candidates are asked important questions about human services. We need to ask them about what their views are on serving children and seniors and people with disabilities. We need to ask them about the relative priority of education or early education, or things that are important to us. Also know that there is a lot of turnover this year. There will be at least 12 from the Senate of 50 senators who are retiring, and that does not even count who might be defeated in an election. So we know that there will be at least 12 new senators and at least 7 new House members. So there will be lots of opportunity to meet with candidates over the summer. Just remember that as a 501c3 nonprofit, if you invite one candidate, you have to invite all of them. They may not all accept your invitation, but it is a good idea to keep your documentation that shows that you weren't showing favoritism to one candidate over another. There are many ways that we work together. These are just a few ways in terms of our two-way communications. Please feel free to forward our newsletters and to coordinate our work together. As the summer study committees are announced, we will be sending out that list of committees, and if you have a particular interest or area of expertise in one of those committee areas, we would love to hear from you, because those client stories really do help impact the summer study process. So forgive us as we move through our slides. We get a little lost. I'm going to open it up for questions now and see. I see a couple questions, so let me just offer, while we're getting, we have a question from Okay, so we have a question from Kathleen Taylor, or a comment actually, about an assurance that anyone who works for a nonprofit that provides affordable rental housing and has had their property tax exemption challenged, please get in touch with Kathleen Taylor with IACED, one of our members at ICHS, and we can try to incorporate that into the study. Again, if any of those study topics, which we went through a number of them, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Follow up after the webinar. If you have other questions, please type them in the question box. I'm looking through. Any other questions about a specific bill that we referenced or maybe passed over and didn't speak about? We'll give it just another minute. I'm not seeing anyone typing. All right, we have a question about teacher background checks. In House Bill 1005, there was a provision. Let's look. I have a question about teacher background checks from House Bill 1005. We are looking that up right now. We know that there was a growing attention to the issue of child abuse reporting with regard to schools and the sharing of information. So the House Bill 1005 does include a provision, includes a number of provisions around the confidentiality agreements that occur when a teacher gets a reference from a current or former employer from another school, that if they have committed an act that resulted in a substantiated report of abuse or neglect, they are required to have that information, as I understand. They provide that the school shall not disclose any of that identifying information regarding the student, but that information about the teacher shall be shared now. There are some other provisions we can follow up with you specifically, but know that it does require schools to conduct checks whether applicants have been the subject of reports in the past. So I hope that answers the question. There is a growing attention to that. Yes, they did pass that provision. Thank you. All right, any other questions? Okay, I have a question that came in on the ID cards for disabled individuals. Do you know who will issue them and how that process works if an organization wants to help clients? So the way that the bill reads for the developmental disability ID bracelet is that the State Department of Health needs to create the process and may contract with a third-party vendor to provide that. They may charge the individual or the organization for the provision of the card or the bracelet, a nominal charge. There is a requirement that it's a nominal charge, but it will be the State Department of Health. I don't recall. We can look up, do you remember what bill number that is? We'll look up the effective date of that bill. Likely it will probably happen after July 1st of this year, but it will be through the State Department of Health. So hopefully that answers that question. Any other questions? Okay. Anything else from our other speakers? Okay, well, thank you to David Sklar, Vice Chair of the ICHS Board, and Maggie Snyder, who staffs the ICHS. This is Lucinda Nord. Thank you for this concludes the recorded part of our webinar, and thank you for joining.